Tell me about the laser experiments with DMT. And apparently, people say that they see "quote unquote" the Matrix. What's going on?
This effect, sometimes happens, sometimes not. The people that I know who have tried it, the effect that they have seen is something that is not surprising to us at Qualia Research. So I'm going to elaborate. So first of all, I think it is true that we live in a world simulation, but essentially, I think that at the very least, that is because our nervous system evolved to create a mini world simulation of our environment, and so it is absolutely the case that you never perceive the world directly, so to speak. Right? Like there's like many layers of indirection and also processing between like photons hitting your eyes and the actual parameters of your world simulation. In fact, you don't even need sensory stimulation to experience like a sense of a world, right? Like you can be dreaming with your eyes closed and still, experience a very rich sense of embodiment and being somewhere, right? So I think it's very important to realize that, psychedelics, meditation, and so on, they're changing the parameters of your world simulation, but that doesn't mean that you're really accessing kind of like other realms outside of you, right? Like I think you're accessing in some sense different realms of consciousness, which is different phases of consciousness. It's similar to how there's like phases of matter. You can have like liquid, solid, air, and so on. My sense is that different states of consciousness are kind of the different phases of consciousness. Maybe the punchline or kind of like the spoiler here is that I actually think that these are phases of a liquid crystal. They're like probably, not to sound too much like a crackpot, but like, probably, Penrose and Hameroff and people who believe that microtubules have something to do with consciousness. I think they're probably right. Not in the full theory, but I do think microtubules probably will end up being really significant for understanding our state of consciousness. And the reason I believe that is that they effectively instantiate a liquid crystal. And you can think of the brain as a networked system of tiny pockets, each of which is composed of liquid crystals, which is how the microtubule lattice is organized. And one of the hypotheses that came out from our retreat in Canada, in particular, was that the effect that something like 5-MeO DMT has in the brain is essentially changing the liquid crystal properties of the neurons. And that, 5-MeO DMT, which produces the God consciousness state, we suspect it kind of like scrambles the liquid crystals in such a way that there's no preferred direction for light. Essentially, it's kind of you end up in a superposition of all possible directions because there's no grooves, as it were. Whereas ayahuasca, mushrooms, DMT, the classic psychedelics, which, 5-MeO is an outlier. It's a very weird kind of like different thing in a sense. But the classic psychedelics, including DMT, what we suspect is actually happening is that it's crystallizing. Rather than just being in kind of this liquid crystal state where the microtubules maybe are like ordered in a certain direction, I think on DMT, they actually become equally spaced apart and organized in a kind of like perfect crystal lattice. And for that reason, effectively, the light becomes coherent, or electromagnetic radiation when it goes through it. As a consequence, effectively, a lot of things of your world simulation on DMT really feel kind of these like coherent, laser-like kind of aspects of this world simulation. It's not uncommon on DMT to, for example, hallucinate, let's say like an angel or something like that is emitting a coherent beam of light. And the hallucination could be like scanning, for example, all of the fields of your experience with a coherent plane of light. I suspect that happens because literally the substrate of your consciousness now is organized in a more crystalline way. And so a lot of the effects that happen on DMT, we think of them as kind of these competing clusters of coherence where like different regions of the brain are probably crystallized, but in different, they become essentially different magnetic domains. And so if you look at something like a laser on DMT, you effectively now have kind of like new ingredients in your world simulation with which to represent that. So, effectively, if you look at stimuli that kind of like matches the physical properties of your world simulation, you will have kind of a stronger resonance with it. And so looking at optical effects on psychedelics, for example, you know what a optical cusp is, right? Like when you take a transparent glass of water, right? Like sometimes the light kind of like forms this kind of like caduceus. Optical cusps look really trippy on DMT, like exceptionally trippy, like in such a way that if you have kind of this naive realist perspective where you think that you're seeing the world directly, it really makes you feel that you're kind of like connecting with a light outside of you in a very, very deep way. But what I suspect is actually happening is more that, hey, you have kind of like, you're turning the inside of your world simulation into actually a kind of like nonlinear optics laboratory. And cusps are kind of like more coherent and meaningful in that state of consciousness. Like there's kind of more agreement between the parts of your world simulation that, yes, there's a coherent beam of light in that direction. As a consequence, if you look at a diffracted laser on DMT, it has a strong effect on your field of experience. But then the symbols that Danny Goller reports, kind of the code of the matrix, as it were, when I've seen drawings of it, and when I've talked to people who have tried the experiment and gotten what apparently is what they're talking about, these are essentially cymatic patterns, which are like these like nonlinear resonant modes of something like a metallic plate, like the classic Cialdini plates. But that is happening like along the strip of the diffracted laser line, and is like filled with those kind of like cymatic nonlinear resonant modes. But to me, that is not surprising. I mean, like to me, that is you're exciting the field of consciousness, and some of the excited states of that field actually look like cymatics. So I don't see it as breaking the code of the matrix or tuning into other realms. I really see it more as kind of like, well, they stumbled upon a way to reliably induce kind of like high energy cymatics in your own consciousness. And it works really well with DMT because DMT essentially crystallizes your liquid crystal matrix, and it creates these very coherent beams of light inside you. Does that make sense?
Yes. So this brings up something that Aldous Huxley and Timothy Leary claimed, which is psychedelics open the doors to perception. Now, the Dalai Lama, I know that we were talking about psychedelic Buddhism, and I asked the question if it was an oxymoron, and you said you don't think so. So I've had my own experiences with meditation and with substances or elixirs, let's say. I've had my excursions with elixirs. So I used to believe that it must be that all of these spiritual insights are all pointing to the same single truth, and that it tends to be an Eastern truth more so than a Western truth. And I just had that in me as just an unconscious adoption from what I hear on the internet. And then I started to do some research. And well, the Dalai Lama said about psychedelics, because he was asked about this, he said, these drugs create more illusions. And in a world filled with illusions, why would you take drugs that only give you more?
Yeah.
And even in the Sagalavada Sutta DN 31, I always mispronounce it, the Buddha warns that taking drugs, anything intoxicating, actually weakens wisdom. He also added that it requires serious practice with the traditional community, and it does not involve external remedies, only internal work. So to say psychedelics are, like, on the one hand, salubrious in that they're useful, they can process trauma, they can bring about changes in one's worldview, they can allow you to connect. This is an entirely different set of statements than the experiences on these are those that the Buddhists are talking about. And it's also a different statement than that the use of these psychedelics and the insights therein are compatible with the Buddhist teachings. So I understand that you brought up the Shinzen Young, but there's a monastic code that explicitly forbids, so Vinaya, I don't know how to pronounce it, that explicitly forbids any drugs. It says liquor, for instance, destroys your sense of shame and weakens you. And what tends to happen with psychedelics is the issue of intention. So motivation, not intention in the philosophical sense, but the reasons you're doing something. So Buddhists, they tend to stress a purity of intention, right intention. And if one is using a drug, it's like they're dissatisfied with the slow and ordinary work of the practice, the discipline that's necessary. It's like a greed for rapid insight. And they have this like aversion to normal consciousness. Those motives contradict the contentment and renunciation that Buddhism encourages. I have several other examples, but I'd like to hear your thoughts so far.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't have a strong stance, and I could be convinced either way. I mean, like maybe as I learn more, I could eventually arrive to like, hey, never take any psychedelics; it's completely misguided.
Oh, just to be clear, I'm not advocating for or against psychedelics. I'm just saying
Yeah,
that the one set of claims, which is that they give you a different sort of insight, a different worldview,
yeah.
they allow you to process trauma and so on. That's an entirely different set of claims than whatever came from the left hand here is compatible with Buddhism. And in fact, there are some reasons to think that it's antithetical to it.
Hmm, hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, I see that. I would think there's also like lots of reasons to believe it is actually quite in harmony with it if used properly. I'll give you a couple examples. So one is, for example, the cultivation of equanimity um, can utilize, for example, taking very cold showers or like a cold plunge, for example. You go to water that is very close to zero Celsius and is like freezing, but you learned to be able to experience that fully without flinching, without stalling, and experience it for like 30 seconds to 1 minute. And let's say you do this, yeah, several times a day. I think a practice like that with the right intention can essentially accelerate the cultivation of equanimity, which, at least in the Shinzen Young paradigm, equanimity is approaching sensations without any resistance. Um, and, like very cold water is a type of kind of like very intense sensation that, if you approach with equanimity, actually has no intrinsic valence. It's just very, very strong energy, which you can turn into bliss or you can turn into suffering depending on how you approach it. And ultimately, I think like how it affects the flow of energy and the configuration of your consciousness. I mean, likewise, I think of psychedelics, at least like classic psychedelics like LSD or psilocybin, kind of as something similar to that. Is kind of like a hot sauce for your consciousness in a way, which is it intensifies everything. Um, and if you approach it with equanimity, with the intention of developing equanimity, I do suspect, similar to a cold plunge, is going to accelerate the process of developing high-end equanimity in such a way that, in the future, when you encounter naturally very unpleasant, very intense sensations, all of that work will actually pay off in that you're not going to freak out, or you're not going to, yeah, kind of become distracted or try to pretend that it's not there, or delude yourself into thinking it doesn't exist, and so on and so forth. So, from that perspective, also, kind of like equanimity around delusions and beliefs, that one of the things that psychedelics kind of like show more clearly in a way is how the valence of a belief is essentially expressed in how it affects the harmony and dissonance of your field. And I think like that disentangling is actually quite a Buddhist move. I mean, understanding that, well, there is the information content that this belief is representing, and then there is your emotional reaction to it. And usually becomes they come so close together. We can't really separate them. And we sort of like just buy into the content of the belief and assume that its valence is kind of a necessary component of it. And one of the things that psychedelics do is that they make that relationship more flexible. Kind of like they melt the connection between a belief and the content of it and your emotional reaction to it. And I think like that, in some sense, is kind of like learning about the mind more broadly, and might make you more resistant to delusions in a way. At the same time, for a lot of people, actually, psychedelic delusions are very tempting, and I think for a lot of people, indeed, exactly what the Dalai Lama said in your quote is absolutely true. No, and I know people who essentially have a relationship to psychedelics where it feels like, yeah, they're kind of like just chasing a new high, or like chasing another mystical experience, rather than yeah, kind of like trying to see the mystical in everyday life. Like that is absolutely also the case. But then another nuance that I want to provide is the difference between constructive and deconstructive, kind of like internal moves and practices. That for most people, I think, especially if they don't have kind of meditation training, um, even if, especially if they don't have kind of like any kind of like long term practice of introspection, um, psychedelics will tend to be very constructive in their effect, in that they will kind of generate very elaborate kind of like world models as a consequence of taking a psychedelic. Something like DMT, I often describe it as as an epistemological hand grenade, because yeah, if you take DMT unprepared, you really may start believe things such as like, well, the Russians have like a base, in the dark side of the moon, and they're like allied with the Greys and and the aliens, and like you just have this very elaborate world model, right? Like to explain data. And one of the things that psychedelics, especially the constructive aspect of them, tend to do is overfit. Essentially, you create very sophisticated, complex models of reality to explain relatively little data, right? It is like how in statistics or machine learning, if you have a series of dots, in a XY plot, if you fit a high degree polynomial, you can always go through all of the dots, right? So
Right.
DMT is like that, right? It's like you have a few data points, and DMT gives you such flexibility in your world model. You can always feed the data with some crazy model. And of course, it's going to be wrong, right? Because it's not going to generalize. It's not going to survive cross validation. So, in that sense, yeah, that's obviously a risk. At the same time, if you know this is something that happens, you can actually use psychedelics to study that process and actually have developed the metacognitive awareness. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm overfeeding right now. This is what overfeeding feels like, which is kind of like an insight that then you can take in everyday life and actually recognize when you're overfeeding in a more mundane, more mundane kind of like state of consciousness. Um, and then, yeah, the final nuance before I pass it on to you again is um, that you can cultivate the deconstructive aspect of psychedelics. And for example, if you take LSD with a strong intention of, for example, just experiencing emptiness or experiencing pure space, kind of absorption into or pure consciousness, you can actually kind of like use that to really let go of trying to be something or trying to go somewhere. And that would be essentially pushing more towards kind of these deconstructed kind of jhana like states of consciousness. And the reason I think 5-MeO DMT is probably the most synergistic with kind of meditation practice and Buddhism is because by default it's a very deconstructive kind of substance. Like by default, 5-MeO DMT tends to kind of like cancel out the topological defects in your consciousness, as it were, and simplify things. Um, the the downside of that is that if you do it a lot, without metacognitive awareness, especially if you don't think in terms of overfeeding or underfeeding or something like that, 5-MeO DMT tends to underfeed your world model. So it's very common for people who take 5-MeO to say something like, "Love is all that matters," or "We're all God, and that's the only thing we should know. That there's nothing else that matters than the fact that we're all God." For me, that's like an oversimplified model of reality. That's kind of you just went too far in the simplifying your sense of reality. But again, you can be metacognitively aware of that and recognize, oh, right now I'm underfeeding. This is what it's like to underfeed. That said, all else being equal, I think probably an underfeeded world model is better than an overfeeded. Um, because an overfeeded model tends to be kind of like heavy and contain like extra stress and vortices, and the complexity costs you in terms of physiological stress, whereas a very underfeeded model of reality is actually typically a pretty pleasant and kind of carefree. Like if you walk around really embodying this sense of like, hey, love is all that matters and there's nothing else we should care about, that's actually not a bad way to live. I mean, like if you're going to live like that in a monastery or in the middle of the forest, it's probably a perfectly fine life. It's just that, yeah, if you interface with very complex systems, then you don't want to overfeed or underfeed. You want to have a good fit, essentially.
New update. Started a Substack. Writings on there are currently about language and ill-defined concepts, as well as some other mathematical details. Much more being written there. This is content that isn't anywhere else. It's not on Theories of Everything. It's not on Patreon. Also, full transcripts will be placed there at some point in the future. Several people ask me, "Hey Curt, you've spoken to so many people in the fields of theoretical physics, philosophy, and consciousness. What are your thoughts?" While I remain impartial in interviews, this Substack is a way to peer into my present deliberations on these topics. Also, thank you to our partner, The Economist.